An elderly man in a worn cardigan pulls up to the Grand Meridian Hotel in his old Honda Civic. Tonight is the night he's been planning for 2 years, ever since his wife Margaret lost her battle with cancer. He has something that will change everything, something that will honor her memory in a way that matters. But the security guards at the entrance take one look at his shabby clothes and scuffed shoes and decide he doesn't belong. They call him confused, suggest he try a soup kitchen instead, threaten to have him arrested for trespassing. The crowd of wealthy guests watches and whispers, some laughing at the crazy old man who thinks he can crash their exclusive $10,000 a plate charity gala. For 20 minutes, they humiliate him. They mock his appearance, question his sanity, and treat him like he's invisible. The event coordinator joins in, bragging about how exclusive the evening is, how only important people with serious money belong in their world. What none of them know is that this quiet old man has something in his pocket that will destroy their assumptions and change their lives forever. What they're about to discover will leave them speechless, ruin careers, and create a story so shocking that it will be talked about for years. Because when you judge someone by their appearance, when you decide their worth based on their clothes and their car, you might just find out that you've made the biggest mistake of your life. And tonight, 3 men are about to learn that lesson in the most devastating way possible. The rain had just stopped when Harold Winters stepped out of his old Honda Civic at the Grand Meridian Hotel. At 72, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned that rushing only led to mistakes. His gray cardigan hung loose over his thin frame, and his worn leather shoes had seen better decades. But his eyes, those sharp blue eyes that had stared down some of the most dangerous criminals in America, still held the same intensity they had 40 years ago. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, those eyes carried something else. Grief, love, and a determination that would have made his late wife Margaret proud. The Grand Meridian towered above him, its golden lights casting long shadows across the marble entrance. Luxury cars lined the circular drive, Bentleys, Maseratis, Rolls-Royces. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed between vehicles, their movements choreographed like a ballet of wealth and status. Harold pulled his cardigan tighter against the evening chill and walked toward the entrance. He had driven 3 hours to get here. 3 hours of memories flooding back with every mile. Margaret's laugh when she beat him at chess. Her hand in his during those final weeks in the hospital. Her whispered words about making sure other families wouldn't go through what they had endured. Cancer had taken her, but it hadn't taken her spirit. That lived on in what Harold was about to do tonight. The massive glass doors of the hotel entrance gleamed under the spotlights. Through them, Harold could see the elegant crowd gathering for the annual Meridian Cancer Research Foundation Gala. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos mingled with women draped in designer gowns that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow reflections across marble floors that stretched into infinity. Harold checked his watch. 7:30. Right on time. He approached the entrance, his footsteps quiet on the polished stone. The closer he got, the more out of place he felt. His cardigan suddenly seemed shabbier, his pants more wrinkled, his shoes more scuffed. But Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. Harold Winters, you've never backed down from anything in your life. Don't start now. That's when he saw them. Derek Manning stood like a fortress at the entrance, his massive frame blocking the doorway. At 28, Derek had the build of someone who spent more time in the gym than reading books. His black security uniform stretched tight across his chest, and his badge gleamed under the lights. His dark hair was slicked back with enough gel to survive a hurricane, and his jaw was set in the permanent scowl of someone who enjoyed saying no. Next to him stood Brandon Cole, 24 and eager to please his boss. Brandon was smaller than Derek but compensated with an attitude twice as large. His uniform was pressed to military precision, and he wore his authority like a crown. Both men had earpieces coiled around their ears and radios clipped to their belts, the tools of their trade displayed like weapons. Harold walked up to them with the same calm confidence he had carried into congressional hearings and crisis situations. He had testified before senators, briefed presidents, and coordinated operations that saved lives. 2 security guards at a charity event should have been nothing. Good evening, Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command. I'm here for the gala. Derek looked him up and down like he was examining a suspect lineup. His eyes traveled from Harold's gray hair to his worn shoes, cataloging every sign of what he perceived as poverty. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. I don't think so, old man. The words hit the air like a slap. Harold blinked, certain he had misheard. "Excuse me? You heard me." Derek stepped forward, using his height advantage to tower over Harold. "This is an exclusive event. Invitation only. And I'm pretty sure you're not on the list." Brandon snickered from behind his boss, the sound sharp and mean. Dude probably saw the fancy cars and thought he could sneak in for free food. Harold felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not anger, he had learned long ago to control that, but something deeper. The same feeling he got when he watched bullies in action, when he saw people abuse whatever small amount of power they had been given. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," Harold said, his voice still steady. "I'm here to make a donation in memory of my wife. She passed away from cancer 2 years ago." Derek's laugh was harsh and grating. "Oh, that's rich. Let me guess, you want to make a $5 donation and think that gets you into a $10,000 a plate dinner?" "Look at him, Derek," Brandon chimed in, emboldened by his boss's cruelty. "That cardigan probably came from a thrift store. Those shoes have holes in them. This guy doesn't have $10,000 to his name." Harold glanced down at his shoes. Brandon was right. There was a small hole near the toe of his left shoe. Margaret had teased him about it just before she got sick, telling him to buy new ones. He never had. These shoes had walked him through 40 years of service to his country. They had carried him through the most important moments of his career. They had stood beside Margaret's hospital bed during her final days. They were good enough for tonight. "The amount of my donation isn't your concern," Harold said quietly. "I just need to speak with someone from the foundation." Derek's eyes narrowed. "Your donation? What are you going to donate, old man?" "Food stamps." The crowd of arriving guests had begun to notice the commotion. Couples in their formal wear slowed their approach to the entrance, whispered conversations beginning as they watched the scene unfold. Harold could feel their stares, could sense their judgment. In their world, appearance was everything. And right now, he looked like exactly what Derek said he was, a confused old man who didn't belong. "Sir," Harold tried again, his patience wearing thin, but his voice still controlled. "I understand you're doing your job, but I assure you I have every right to be here. If you could just check with your supervisor or someone from the foundation board dash." "My supervisor." Derek's voice rose, loud enough now that more people were stopping to watch. "I am the supervisor, Grandpa. I'm head of security for this event, and I'm telling you to move along before I call the real police." A young couple emerged from a silver BMW at the valet stand. The man wore a tuxedo that probably cost more than Harold's monthly pension, and the woman's diamond necklace caught the light like captured stars. They paused at the commotion, the woman leaning into her companion's ear. "Is that man bothering the security guards?" she whispered, not as quietly as she thought. "Probably another homeless person looking for handouts," the man replied with disgust. "They always show up at these charity events." Harold heard every word. In 40 years of law enforcement, he had developed exceptional hearing. It came with the territory when your life often depended on catching whispered conversations and subtle threats. But tonight, that skill felt more like a curse. Brandon stepped closer, his chest puffed out with borrowed authority. "You need to leave." "No. Before this gets embarrassing for everyone." "Embarrassing for who?" Harold asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "For you, old man," Derek snarled. "Because in about 30 seconds, I'm going to have you escorted off this property by real police officers who won't be as nice as we've been." More guests had gathered now, forming a loose semicircle around the entrance. Harold could hear their murmured conversations, could feel their judgment pressing down on him like a weight. Some looked amused, as if watching a street performer. Others seemed annoyed that their elegant evening was being disrupted by such an unseemly display. A woman in a flowing purple gown shook her head sadly. "It's so tragic when they get confused like that. Someone should call his family." Harold's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of restraining himself. He had spent decades dealing with criminals who at least had the honesty to admit they were breaking the law. These people, these guards, these guests, they hid their cruelty behind social norms and assumed superiority. "Derek, right?" Harold said, reading the name tag on the guard's uniform. "And Brandon. I want you both to understand something very clearly. I'm not confused. I am not lost. I am not homeless. I am here for a very specific reason, and I have every right to be here." Derek's face flushed red with anger. You have the right to leave before I make you leave. That's the only right you have here, old man. You keep calling me old man, Harold observed, his voice taking on a different quality. Not louder, but somehow more present, more commanding. Do you think age makes someone less deserving of respect? I think showing up to a formal event dressed like you just crawled out of a dumpster makes you less deserving of respect. Derek shot back, pleased with his own wit. Brandon laughed and high-fived his boss. Boom. Roasted. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some people were taking out their phones now, though whether to call for help or document the spectacle, Harold couldn't tell. A valet approached hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unsure how to intervene. That's when Victor Sterling arrived. Victor strode up the walkway like he owned not just the hotel, but the entire city block. At 45, he had perfected the art of looking successful. His Italian suit fit like it had been sewn directly onto his body. His silver hair was styled to casual perfection, and his smile was the kind that never quite reached his eyes. As the event coordinator for the Meridian Cancer Research Foundation Gala, Victor considered himself the guardian of exclusivity, the gatekeeper of high society. He took in the scene with practiced efficiency, the growing crowd, the agitated security guards, the old man in the shabby cardigan, who was clearly the source of all this unwanted attention. What seems to be the problem here? Victor asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. Derek straightened up, suddenly professional in front of his ultimate boss. Mr. Sterling, this gentleman is trying to gain entry to the gala, but he's not properly dressed and he's not on any guest list. We've been trying to explain that this is an exclusive event, but he's being difficult. Victor's gaze swept over Harold with a kind of assessment usually reserved for used car purchases. Harold could practically see the calculations running through the man's head: threadbare clothing, old shoes, no obvious signs of wealth or status. In Victor's world, those were the only measurements that mattered. I see, Victor said slowly. He turned to Harold with a smile that was all surface, no substance. Sir, I'm Victor Sterling, the event coordinator for tonight's gala. I'm sure you can understand that this is a very exclusive fundraising event. Our guests have paid substantial amounts to be here tonight, and we have to maintain certain standards. Standards, Harold repeated, the words sitting heavy in the air between them. Exactly, Victor said, warming to his theme. This isn't just any charity dinner. This is the premier social event of the season. We have senators here tonight, Fortune 500 CEOs, celebrities, philanthropists who donate millions to worthy causes. The entry fee alone is $10,000 per person, and that's before the auction begins. Harold listened patiently as Victor continued his sales pitch for exclusivity. The wine we're serving tonight costs more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a month. The entertainment includes a Grammy-winning jazz quartet and a world-renowned chef who flew in from Paris just for this event. This isn't the kind of gathering where someone can simply walk in off the street. Off the street? Harold echoed. I don't mean to be unkind, Victor continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. But surely you can see how your presence might make our other guests uncomfortable. They've invested heavily in this cause, and they expect a certain atmosphere, a certain level of sophistication. The crowd around them had grown larger. Word was spreading through the valet area and into the hotel lobby that some kind of confrontation was taking place at the entrance. More phones had appeared, though Harold noticed that no one was actually calling for help. They were all just watching, treating his humiliation like entertainment. What cause would that be? Harold asked quietly. Victor blinked, surprised by the question. The cause? Well, it's the Meridian Cancer Research Foundation, of course. We're raising money for cutting-edge cancer research, new treatment facilities, programs to help families affected by this terrible disease. Cancer research, Harold said, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of something deeper. Not anger, not frustration, but something that made Victor take an unconscious step backward. Yes, that's right. Very important work. Very expensive work. Which is why we need to maintain the integrity of our fundraising events. I'm sure you understand. Harold reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her arm around Harold in what was clearly a hospital room. Both of them were trying to look happy, but the woman's thin frame and bald head told a different story. This is my wife, Margaret, Harold said, his voice soft enough that the crowd had to strain to hear him. She died of ovarian cancer 2 years ago. Stage 4. We fought it for 3 years before it finally won. Victor's practiced smile faltered slightly. I'm, I'm sorry for your loss. But surely you can see that this isn't the appropriate venue for dash. She made me promise, Harold continued, as if Victor hadn't spoken. During those last weeks, when the pain was so bad that morphine barely helped, she made me promise to do something meaningful with the money we'd saved. She said other families shouldn't have to go through what we went through. She said maybe our savings could help find better treatments, better outcomes. The crowd had gone completely quiet now. Even Derek and Brandon seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. That's very touching, Victor said, his tone carefully neutral. And I'm sure there are many worthy local charities that would appreciate a modest donation. But this particular event, how much? Harold asked. I'm sorry, how much does it cost to make a difference? You mentioned $10,000 for dinner. How much to actually fund research? How much to build a treatment center? How much to make sure other wives don't have to die the way Margaret did? Victor's discomfort was growing by the minute. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. Usually, when he had to turn people away, they got angry or embarrassed and left. They didn't ask pointed questions about the foundation's actual work. Well, that depends on many factors. Major donations, the kind that really make an impact, they start in the hundreds of thousands. Millions, really, if you want to establish endowments or fund entire research programs. Millions, Harold repeated thoughtfully. Derek had heard enough. The crowd, the questions, the uncomfortable mood that had settled over what should have been a simple removal of an unwanted person. It was all making him look bad in front of his boss. Time to end this. Look, this is getting ridiculous, Derek announced loudly. Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, we're wasting time here. This guy obviously doesn't have the kind of money you're talking about. Look at him. Look at his clothes, his car, his whole situation. He's probably on Social Security, maybe gets a few $100s a month. He's living in some fantasy where his pension check makes him a philanthropist. Brandon nodded eagerly. Exactly. Sir, we appreciate that you want to help, but maybe you should donate to something more realistic. Like the local food bank or something. Victor seized on this return to familiar territory. My colleagues make a valid point. There are many worthy causes that will be appropriate for smaller donations. The Salvation Army, local homeless shelters, community food programs. I'm sure any of those organizations would be grateful for whatever you could contribute. Harold looked around at the faces surrounding him. Wealthy guests in their formal wear, watching him like he was an exhibit at a zoo. Security guards drunk on their small portion of power. An event coordinator who measured human worth in dollar signs. All of them so certain they knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. You think you know me, Harold said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. All of you. You've looked at my clothes, my car, my age, and you decided exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. He took a step forward, and something in his posture made Derek's hand move instinctively toward his radio. You see an old man in a cardigan, and you assume poverty. You see worn shoes and think homeless. You see someone who doesn't fit your definition of success, and you decide they don't belong in your world. Harold's blue eyes swept across the crowd, meeting each gaze with steady intensity. But here's what you don't see. You don't see the 40 years I spent serving my country. You don't see the cases I solved, the lives I saved, the criminals I put behind bars. You don't see the commendations, the medals, the respect I earned from presidents and senators and foreign heads of state. The crowd was completely silent now. You don't see the modest life Margaret and I chose to live, saving our money instead of spending it on expensive clothes and fancy cars. You don't see the investment decisions we made, the compound interest that grew over decades, the wealth we accumulated not for ourselves, but for moments exactly like this one. Harold reached into his other pocket, his fingers closing around something that would change everything. But not yet. Not quite yet. Most importantly, you don't see who I really am. What I really am. What I've been trying to tell you since I walked up those steps. Derek's face was red with anger and embarrassment. The crowd, the questions, the way this old man was making him look foolish in front of his boss, it all needed to end now. Enough, Derek snarled. I don't care about your sob story or your fantasy life. You're trespassing on private property, and I'm done being nice about it. He reached for Harold's arm, intending to escort him away by force if necessary. That's when Harold smiled for the first time all evening. It wasn't a happy smile or a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent 40 years dealing with bullies and criminals and people who thought power meant they could do whatever they wanted to whomever they wanted. It was the smile of someone who was about to teach a very important lesson. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made Derek's hand freeze inches from Harold's sleeve. The crowd held its breath, sensing that something was about to change, that this strange confrontation was about to take a turn that none of them had expected. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather folder. He held it for a moment, looking at the three men who had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating him, judging him, trying to make him feel small and unwanted and worthless. Then he opened it. The badge gleamed under the hotel's bright lights like a beacon of authority. Gold lettering on dark leather spelled out words that made Derek's confidence near freeze on his face. Federal Bureau of Investigation Director. Below it, a photograph of a younger Harold Winters stared back at them, the same sharp blue eyes, the same determined expression, but wearing the formal uniform of America's top law enforcement official. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The crowd of wealthy guests, the security guards, Victor Sterling, everyone stood in stunned silence as the reality of what they were seeing sank in. This wasn't just any old man they had been humiliating. This was Harold Winters, former director of the FBI, one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in American history. Derek's hand, which had been reaching for Harold's arm, slowly dropped to his side. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then a growing horror as he realized exactly what he had done. Brandon took a step backward, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. But Harold wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He closed the badge holder with a quiet snap and slipped it back into his pocket, his movements deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had briefed presidents and testified before Congress. "Now that we've established who I am," Harold said, his blue eyes moving from Derek to Brandon to Victor, "let's talk about what's going to happen next." Derek tried to recover, his voice shaking slightly. "Sir, we didn't know. I mean, you weren't wearing." "I wasn't wearing what?" Harold interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "A uniform? Badge? A sign announcing my credentials? Is that how you determine who deserves respect? By their clothes and their job title?" The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, word spreading through the hotel that something extraordinary was happening at the entrance. Valets had stopped moving cars, hotel staff had emerged from the lobby, and arriving guests were abandoning their vehicles to witness this unprecedented scene. Victor Sterling cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. "Director Winters, I had no idea. If you had just identified yourself from the beginning." "If I had identified myself?" Harold's voice rose for the first time, and the crowd instinctively took a step back. "So you're saying that respect is conditional? That basic human decency only applies to people with impressive titles?" He walked closer to Victor, who, despite being younger and larger, found himself backing away from the elderly man's intensity. "Let me tell you what I've learned about character, Mr. Sterling. It's not what you do when you know someone is important. It's what you do when you think they're nobody. It's how you treat the powerless, not the powerful." Harold turned to address the entire crowd now, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "For the past 20 minutes, I've been insulted, humiliated, and threatened. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because these three men decided that my appearance gave them the right to treat me like garbage." Derek's face was now pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Director, please, we were just doing our jobs." "Your jobs?" Harold's laugh was cold and bitter. "Your job is to provide security, not to judge people's worth based on their clothing. Your job is to protect guests, not to humiliate elderly men who are trying to honor their dead wives." Brandon found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. We didn't mean any disrespect." "Didn't mean any disrespect?" Harold repeated, his voice rising again. "You call me confused. You said I crawled out of a dumpster. You suggested I was homeless, that I was looking for handouts, that I belonged at a soup kitchen instead of here." Each accusation hit the air like a physical blow, and Harold's voice grew stronger with each one. "You made jokes about my clothes, my car, my age. You threatened to have me arrested for trespassing. You told me I was embarrassing myself and everyone else here." He turned back to Derek, stepping close enough that the security guard had to look up to meet his eyes. But most importantly, you decided that an old man in a cardigan couldn't possibly have anything meaningful to contribute to cancer research. You assumed that someone who doesn't dress like you couldn't possibly understand loss, or grief, or the desire to make a difference. Derek's radio crackled to life, probably his backup team wondering where he was, but he was too stunned to respond. His entire worldview was crumbling around him. This man he had been treating like a vagrant was someone who had commanded respect from the highest levels of government. Harold reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a folded letter on expensive stationery. He unfolded it carefully, his movements deliberate. "This is a letter from the Meridian Cancer Research Foundation Board of Directors," he announced to the crowd. "It was sent to me 3 weeks ago, personally inviting me to tonight's gala." Victor's face went white. That's impossible. I handle all the invitations personally. I would have recognized your name, would you?" Harold asked, raising one eyebrow. "Or would you have filed it away with all the other important people you needed to accommodate tonight?" He began to read from the letter, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent crowd. "Dear Mr. Winters, it is our tremendous honor to invite you to serve as our guest of honor at this year's annual gala. Your generous contribution to our foundation has made possible breakthrough research that has already saved countless lives." Victor's legs seemed to give out slightly, and he had to steady himself against a nearby pillar. Harold continued reading. "We understand that you prefer to maintain your privacy regarding your philanthropic activities, but we hope that on this special evening, you might consider allowing us to publicly acknowledge your extraordinary generosity." The crowd was hanging on every word now, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple misunderstanding. "Your anonymous donation of $50 million established our foundation and funded our first 5 years of research. The Winters Cancer Research Wing of our facility serves hundreds of patients every month, though we have honored your request to keep your name confidential until now." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. $50 million. This man they had been watching get humiliated was one of the most significant philanthropists in the region. But Harold wasn't finished reading. "We know that this donation was made in memory of your beloved wife, Margaret, and we hope that seeing the lives being saved every day through the research your gift made possible brings you some measure of comfort." Harold folded the letter carefully and looked up at the 3 men who had been so certain of his worthlessness. $50 million, he said quietly. "That's what I donated anonymously 3 years ago. Margaret's life insurance policy, our retirement savings, the inheritance from her parents, the investments we made over 40 years of marriage. Everything we had saved for our golden years together." His voice grew stronger, more commanding. "Margaret died in my arms at City General Hospital because they didn't have the equipment for experimental treatments. She died because the research that might have saved her hadn't been funded yet. She died because people like me, people who could make a difference, were keeping their money to themselves." Harold turned to face Derek directly. "So tell me, Mr. Manning, now that you know who I am and what I've contributed, do I suddenly deserve respect? Am I suddenly worthy of basic human decency? Has my net worth made me more valuable as a person?" Derek couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Harold moved to Brandon next. "And you, Mr. Cole, now that you know I'm not homeless, not confused, not looking for handouts, do you want to take back your jokes about soup kitchens? Do you want to apologize for laughing at my clothes and my car?" Brandon's face was bright red, shame and fear warring for control of his expression. Finally, Harold turned to Victor. "And you, Mr. Sterling, now that you know I'm the anonymous donor who made your career possible, who funded the very foundation you represent, do I suddenly meet your standards? Am I sophisticated enough now for your exclusive event?" Victor tried to speak, his voice coming out as a croak. "Director Winters, we had no idea." "No idea of what?" Harold's voice was like a blade. "No idea that I was important. No idea that I was wealthy. No idea that I was worthy of basic respect." He stepped closer to Victor, and the event coordinator actually flinched. "Or no idea that every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they're wearing or what car they drive?" The crowd around them had grown to nearly 100 people now. Hotel guests, staff, valets, passers-by from the street, all drawn by the unfolding drama. Some were recording with their phones, though discreetly. Others were whispering among themselves, trying to process what they were witnessing. Harold raised his voice to address all of them. I want everyone here to understand something very important. I didn't reveal my identity to prove my worth. I revealed it to prove a point about yours." He gestured toward the three men who had humiliated him. These three men treated me with contempt not because of anything I had done, but because of what I looked like. They made assumptions about my value as a human being based on my appearance, my age, and their own prejudices. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. They would have been perfectly happy to let me stand in the cold, to insult me, to threaten me, to drive me away from an event I helped create, because they decided I wasn't good enough for their world. Harold pulled out his phone, an older model that probably cost a tenth of what most people in the crowd were carrying. I could call the mayor right now. He's in my contact list. I could call the governor. I could call senators, congressmen, Supreme Court justices. I could call the current FBI director, who worked under me for 15 years. He held up the phone for everyone to see. I could have this entire hotel cleared by federal agents in 20 minutes. I could have these three men arrested for harassment, for creating a public disturbance, for interfering with a federal official. I could destroy their careers with a single phone call. Derek was visibly shaking now, the full weight of his situation crashing down on him. "But I'm not going to do that," Harold continued, lowering his phone, "because that would make me just like them. That would make me someone who uses power to hurt people instead of help them." He looked at each of the three men in turn. "Instead, I'm going to let you live with the consequences of your choices. I'm going to let you explain to your bosses, your families, your friends, how you treated a grieving widower who came here to honor his dead wife's memory." Harold's voice grew quiet, but somehow more menacing. "I'm going to let you wake up every morning for the rest of your lives knowing that you had the chance to show kindness to someone in pain, and instead you chose cruelty. I'm going to let you live with the knowledge that you judged someone's worth by their appearance and found yourself catastrophically wrong." He turned back to the crowd, his voice carrying to every person present. "But most importantly, I want to let all of you witness what happens when we treat people as less than human. When we decide that respect is something that has to be earned through wealth or status or appearance." Harold began walking toward the hotel entrance, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. "Margaret always said that character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when you think no one important is watching." He paused at the entrance, turning back one final time. Tonight, everyone was watching. And now everyone knows exactly what kind of character these three men possess. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. "Director Winters, please. We made a mistake. We didn't know." Harold's smile was sad and tired. "No, Mr. Manning. You made a choice. You knew exactly what you were doing when you decided I was beneath your notice. You knew exactly what you were doing when you chose to humiliate someone you perceived as powerless." He looked at all three men one final time. "The only thing you didn't know was that I had the power to expose your true nature to the world. But that power doesn't change who you are. It just reveals it." Harold walked through the hotel entrance, leaving behind a crowd of stunned onlookers and three men whose lives had just been irrevocably changed. But the evening was far from over. What Harold did next would ensure that this night became a legend, a story that would be told and retold for years to come. The real karma was just beginning. Harold walked through the gleaming doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel, leaving behind the chaos he had unleashed outside. But the three men who had humiliated him were about to discover that the storm was far from over. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a perfect example of how the universe has a way of balancing the scales. The hotel lobby was a masterpiece of marble and crystal, with soaring ceilings and artwork that cost more than most people's houses. Guests in their formal were moved through the space like elegant ghosts, their conversations a quiet murmur of wealth and privilege. But tonight, all of that was about to change. Harold approached the concierge desk, where a young man in an impeccable uniform was arranging papers with military precision. His name tag read James Mitchell, and at 26, he had the kind of polished professionalism that comes from years of serving the ultra-wealthy. "Good evening, sir," James said with a warm smile. "How may I assist you tonight?" "I need to speak with the hotel manager immediately," Harold said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect for 40 years. "Tell him Harold Winters is here." James's eyes widened slightly. Even though he was too young to have worked directly with Harold during his FBI days, the name was legendary in law enforcement circles. He picked up his phone immediately. "Mr. Richardson, Harold Winters is here in the lobby." "Yes, sir." "That Harold Winters. He wants to see you immediately. Within minutes, Robert Richardson appeared from a side office, moving with the kind of urgency reserved for visits from presidents or other dignitaries. At 52, Richardson had managed the Grand Meridian for over a decade, and he knew exactly who Harold Winters was and what his presence meant. "Director Winters," Richardson said, extending his hand with obvious respect. "This is an unexpected honor. How can we help you tonight?" "There's been an incident at your front entrance," Harold said simply. "Your security team has been harassing guests, and I think you need to address it immediately." Richardson's face went pale. "Security team? What kind of harassment?" "The kind that could destroy your hotel's reputation in about 30 seconds once word gets out," Harold replied. "I suggest you come with me." They walked back toward the entrance together, Richardson's anxiety growing with each step. As they approached the doors, they could see the crowd that had gathered outside, still buzzing with excitement over what they had witnessed. Derek, Brandon, and Victor were huddled together near the entrance, their faces grim as they tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. Derek was on his radio, probably calling for backup, while Brandon paced nervously. Victor was on his phone, likely trying to reach someone higher up in the Foundation hierarchy. "Those are your security guards," Harold said, pointing to Derek and Brandon. "And that's Victor Sterling, your event coordinator." Richardson watched through the glass doors as Derek gestured angrily at the crowd, clearly trying to disperse them. Even from inside, they could see that the situation was far from under control. "What exactly happened?" Richardson asked, though he was already dreading the answer. Harold gave him a condensed version of the evening's events, watching as the hotel manager's expression grew more horrified with each detail. By the time Harold finished, Richardson looked like he might be sick. "They refused you entry. They called you homeless. They threatened to have you arrested." Richardson's voice was rising with each question. "Do they have any idea who you are?" "They do now," Harold said quietly. "But that's not the point. The point is how they treat people they think are nobody." Richardson was already moving toward the door. "Director Winters, I am so sorry. This is completely unacceptable. I'll have them fired immediately." "Wait," Harold said, placing a hand on the manager's arm. "Let me show you something first." He pulled out his phone and made a call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Governor Mitchell's office. This is Harold Winters. I need to speak with Tom immediately." "Director Winters?" "Of course, sir. Let me patch you through right away." Richardson watched in amazement as Harold was connected directly to the governor of the state. Their conversation was brief but pointed. "Tom, I'm at the Grand Meridian Hotel, and I need a favor." "Yes, the charity gala. There's been a situation with hotel security that I think you should know about." Harold spent the next few minutes explaining what had happened, his voice calm and professional. Richardson could only hear one side of the conversation, but the governor's reaction was apparently strong enough that Harold had to hold the phone away from his ear at one point. "Yes, I understand your concern," Harold said, "but I want to handle this appropriately. Can you have Attorney General Williams call me in 5 minutes? I want to discuss the legal implications of what happened here tonight." When Harold hung up, Richardson was staring at him with a mixture of awe and terror. "The Attorney General," Richardson whispered. "Public humiliation, harassment, discrimination based on age and appearance, creating a hostile environment," Harold said matter-of-factly. "Any decent lawyer could make a case that what happened tonight constitutes several different violations of civil rights law." Before Richardson could respond, Harold's phone rang again. This time it was someone even more impressive. "Director Winters? This is Attorney General Williams. The governor briefed me on your situation. I'm very sorry to hear about what you experienced tonight." Harold put the phone on speaker so Richardson could hear the conversation. "I appreciate your concern, General. I'm standing here with the hotel manager, and I think he needs to understand the full scope of what his employees did tonight." "Absolutely," Williams's voice came through clearly. "Mr. Richardson, I assume? You need to understand that what happened tonight could have serious legal ramifications for your hotel. Discrimination, harassment, violation of civil rights. These are federal matters." Richardson's knees seemed to give out slightly. "Yes, sir. I understand completely. We'll take immediate action." "I hope so," Williams continued. "Because Director Winters has friends throughout the federal government, and if word of this incident spreads, it could create significant problems for your establishment." When the call ended, Richardson was practically hyperventilating. Director Winters, please tell me what I can do to make this right. Whatever you need, whatever you want, it's yours. Harold studied the manager for a moment, then smiled slightly. I want justice, Mr. Richardson. Real justice. Not just for me, but for every person who might be treated the way I was treated tonight. Anything. Just tell me what that looks like. Harold walked to the window and pointed at the 3 men outside. Those security guards need to be fired immediately. Not suspended, not reprimanded, fired. And I want their termination to be public so that other hotels and security companies know exactly why they're unemployable. Richardson nodded frantically. Done. What else? Victor Sterling needs to be removed from his position with the foundation. His behavior tonight showed a complete lack of understanding of what charity means, what compassion looks like. I'll contact the foundation board immediately. Harold's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it and smiled grimly. That's interesting. It seems the governor has been making some calls of his own. Apparently, Derek Manning has a criminal record that wasn't properly disclosed when he was hired. 2 assault charges that were dropped because the victims didn't want to press charges. Richardson's face went white. Criminal record? We run background checks on all security personnel. Apparently not thorough ones, Harold said. And Brandon Cole. It turns out he's been posting videos on social media of guests at various hotels where he's worked, making fun of people he considers beneath him. The foundation board is very interested in seeing those videos. Harold's phone rang again. This time, it was someone from the Meridian Cancer Research Foundation Board of Directors. Harold, this is Catherine Wright from the Foundation Board. We just heard about what happened tonight, and we're absolutely horrified. Harold put the call on speaker again. Catherine, I'm here with the hotel manager. I think you should know that your event coordinator was part of what happened tonight. Victor Sterling, we're already aware. We've been reviewing his social media posts, and frankly, his attitude toward people he considers lower class is completely antithetical to our mission. He's been terminated, effective immediately. Richardson slumped against the wall. The situation was spiraling completely out of control. Harold, Catherine continued, we want to make this right. We're prepared to make a public statement about what happened tonight, and we want to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. I appreciate that, Catherine. But I have a better idea. Harold walked back to the window, looking out at the crowd that was still gathered outside. Derek was arguing with someone on his radio, his face red with anger and frustration. Brandon was sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. Victor was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. I want to turn this into a teaching moment, Harold said. A very public teaching moment. What did you have in mind? Catherine asked. Harold smiled, and there was something almost predatory about it. I want to hold a press conference. Right here, right now. I want to tell the world exactly what happened tonight, and I want everyone to see the consequences of treating people with contempt. Richardson looked like he might faint. A press conference? Tonight. Right now, Harold confirmed. Catherine, can you get some reporters here in the next hour? Harold, with your reputation and what happened tonight, I can get every major news outlet in the state here in 30 minutes. Perfect. Mr. Richardson, I'm going to need you to gather all your staff who were involved in tonight's incident. Security guards, event coordinators, anyone who witnessed what happened. Director Winters, please, surely we can handle this more quietly. Harold's expression hardened. Quietly? The way you handled Margaret's death quietly? The way you handled the humiliation of an elderly man quietly? The way you would have handled it if I had just been some nobody in a cardigan? Richardson realized he had made a mistake. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. No, you didn't mean it, Harold said firmly. You meant that now that you know who I am, now that you understand the power I wield and the connections I have, you want to make this go away quietly. You want to sweep it under the rug and pretend it never happened. Harold's phone buzzed with another text message. He read it, and his smile grew wider. Interesting. It seems Derek Manning just tried to call his supervisor to get his story straight. Unfortunately for him, his supervisor just received a call from the mayor's office about the incident. Derek is no longer employed by the hotel. Richardson blinked in confusion. But I didn't. You didn't fire him yet, Harold agreed. But word travels fast in certain circles. When the mayor calls a hotel owner about a security incident involving a former FBI director, things happen very quickly. Harold's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number that made Richardson's eyes widen in recognition. Harold, this is Marcus Thompson, owner of the Grand Meridian Hotel. I just received some very disturbing calls about an incident at my property tonight. Even through the phone, Thompson's voice carried the weight of serious money and serious power. Marcus, Harold said warmly. I was wondering when you'd hear about tonight's festivities. I've heard enough to know that my hotel's reputation is about to take a very public hit unless we handle this correctly. I'm flying in from Dallas right now, but I wanted to call you personally to apologize. I appreciate that, Marcus. But apologies aren't going to fix what happened tonight. What do you need from me? Harold looked at Richardson, who was practically vibrating with anxiety. I need you to make sure that what happened to me tonight never happens to anyone else. I need you to implement policies that protect people from being judged and humiliated based on their appearance. Done. What else? I need you to make sure that the employees who were involved in tonight's incident face real consequences. Not just a slap on the wrist, but consequences that send a message to everyone in your organization. Harold, you have my word. By the time I land in 2 hours, every employee involved in this incident will be terminated. No severance, no references, no second chances. Harold looked out the window again. Derek was now arguing with someone who had apparently arrived to collect his security equipment. Brandon was being escorted away from the premises by 2 men in suits. Victor was nowhere to be seen. It looks like your people are already taking action, Harold observed. I don't tolerate discrimination or harassment at my properties, Thompson said firmly. What happened to you tonight is exactly the kind of behavior that destroys businesses and hurts innocent people. Harold's phone buzzed with yet another message. This one made him laugh out loud. What is it? Richardson asked nervously. It seems that Victor Sterling just discovered that his contract with 3 other major hotels in the city has been terminated. Word is spreading quickly through the hospitality industry. Harold put Thompson back on speaker. Marcus, your manager here, has been very cooperative, but I think he needs to understand the full scope of what happened tonight. Mr. Richardson, Thompson's voice came through clearly. I want you to understand something. Director Winters could destroy our entire business with a single interview. The fact that he's being reasonable about this situation is a gift that we don't deserve. Richardson nodded frantically, even though Thompson couldn't see him. Yes, sir. I understand completely. Good. Because I want you to make sure that by the time I arrive, every aspect of the situation has been addressed. Security protocols revised, staff retrained, policies updated. I want a complete overhaul of how we treat guests. Absolutely, sir. Harold ended the call and turned to Richardson. Now about that press conference. Richardson looked defeated. Director Winters, is there any way we can avoid making this a public spectacle? Harold considered the question for a moment. Let me ask you something, Mr. Richardson. If I had been just a regular old man at Cardigan, with no connections and no power, what would have happened tonight? Richardson thought about it honestly. You would have been turned away and forgotten. Exactly. You would have let your employees humiliate an elderly man who was trying to honor his dead wife, and there would have been no consequences whatsoever. Harold's voice grew harder. But because I happen to have the power to fight back, suddenly everyone wants to make things right. Suddenly everyone wants to avoid consequences. He walked closer to Richardson. The press conference isn't about punishment, Mr. Richardson. It's about making sure this never happens again. It's about showing the world what happens when we judge people by their appearance instead of their character. Before Richardson could respond, Harold's phone rang one more time. The caller ID showed a familiar name that made him smile. Harold, this is Chief Justice Roberts. I just heard about what happened to you tonight, and I wanted to call personally to express my outrage. Richardson's jaw dropped. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was calling about their hotel incident. John, I appreciate your concern, Harold said, putting the call on speaker. But I think the situation is being handled appropriately. I certainly hope so. What happened to you tonight represents everything that's wrong with how we treat people in this country. The idea that respect is conditional based on wealth or status is fundamentally un-American. Harold looked at Richardson, who was now sweating profusely. I agree completely, John, which is why I'm planning to use this incident as a teaching moment. Good. And Harold, if you need any support, any resources, anything at all, you know you have friends throughout the federal government who will back you up. When the call ended, Richardson looked like he might collapse. "The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court," he whispered. "He called about our hotel." "Power has a way of revealing itself," Harold said simply. "The question is, what are you going to do with the knowledge you've gained tonight?" Harold walked to the window one more time. Outside, the crowd was finally beginning to disperse. Derek and Brandon were gone, their security equipment confiscated, their careers in ruins. Victor was nowhere to be seen, probably trying to figure out how to explain to his family that he had just lost multiple jobs in a single evening. "The press conference will be in 1 hour," Harold announced. "I want you to gather every employee who witnessed what happened tonight. I want them to hear what I have to say about respect, dignity, and the consequences of judging people by their appearance." Richardson nodded weakly. "Yes, sir. Whatever you need." Harold's phone buzzed with a final message of the evening. He read it and smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Perfect. It seems that Derek Manning's employment has been terminated by the private security company that contracted him to your hotel. Brandon Cole has been fired as well. And the security company has issued a public statement distancing themselves from their actions." He looked at Richardson one final time. "Justice isn't always swift, Mr. Richardson, but it is inevitable. What happened tonight will be remembered long after all of us are gone. The question is, what lesson will people take from it?" Harold walked toward the elevator, leaving Richardson standing alone in the lobby, contemplating the ruins of what had started as an elegant evening. But Harold wasn't finished yet. The press conference would be the final act in this drama, and he intended to make sure that everyone who heard the story would understand the true cost of treating people with contempt. The security guards were fired, their reputations destroyed, their careers over. Victor Sterling's professional life lay in ruins. The hotel faced a public relations nightmare that would take years to overcome. But more importantly, the world would learn that respect isn't something you give only to the powerful. It's something you give to everyone, because you never know when the person you're judging might be the one with the power to teach you the most important lesson of your life. The karma was complete, swift, and absolutely devastating. And Harold Winters, the man they had tried to humiliate, walked away with his dignity intact and his message delivered with perfect, brutal clarity.